All right. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to our AIRA talks, and thank you for joining us. My name is Adibora Dulami. I am the coordinator for the African Internet Rights Alliance, popularly known as AIRA. AIRA is, like the name implies, an alliance of 10 civil society organizations leading the work of digital rights and internet freedoms on the African continent. You probably most likely have heard of all, some, if not all, of our members. And our goal really is to work together to protect and to promote digital rights and internet freedoms across the continent. We want to support African digital rights defenders in the important work that they do. And IRA Talks is one of the ways that we do that. It's a platform that creates an opportunity for policymakers and civil society leaders and representatives from different various organizations, some of whom are coming into the meeting right now, to have conversations, to convene, to share experiences, to ask questions, and to learn, right? So today we're very excited to have um, our panel of experts who are going to explore the emerging role of African data protection authorities that are springing up on the go all around. And we're going to be exploring whether they can serve as de facto AI regulators. We all know that most DPAs are not originally designed, particularly for this role. They have a much more broader role, but they're increasingly being called upon to develop guidance and to assess risks and to oversee algorithmic systems that affect millions of people. And so I am also extremely excited, and I've been looking forward to this very insightful conversation. I will not be your moderator. We have a very capable young man. I don't know if I'm allowed to say young man, but a capable person in our midst, Kimal Daniel Harvey, who's an attorney at the Legal Resources Center, and he will be your moderator. Um, once again, welcome, and please, let's make this as interactive as possible. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat, and let us hear from you as well. Over to you, Kimal.
Thank you, Adeboro. Yes, I accept the young man title. I am just a very young 30, so I'll take it. So as Adeboro said at the top, this is the second IRA Talks of the year. Um, we hold one every quarter, so you'll find the previous ones of the IRA Talks on their website or on the YouTube channel. The details will be put in the chat. Today's discussion is called From Data Protection to Algorithmic Oversight. Are data protection authorities in Africa, are they Africa's best bet for ethical AI governance? So as Adebora said at the top, this session is going to be recorded. And so we encourage your coverage of digital rights in the conversation today, and you can watch it back later. If you have any questions or on what we're talking about today or specific topics that you want us to explore maybe in the future, please follow up with Adeboro. But if you want to ask questions about this topic, there will be a session later for questions and answers. So I also invite you to follow IRA on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, or visit the website. So that's ira.africa. Um, and the YouTube channel is IRA Digital Rights. If you want to learn more about the Alliance and also see the previous IRA talks. And Adebora will share the links to the profiles down below in the chat. So, little introduction and overhead of what we're talking about today. Artificial intelligence systems are becoming embedded in almost everything we do. I mean, a lot of us in the sector know this already. From digital lending, biometric voter registration, smart city surveillance, school monitoring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And while AI certainly seems like an exciting and innovative development in our time, in the African context, it really raises the questions about accountability, fairness, and public interest. And these questions are quite urgent, specifically if you understand the history of how innovation in this kind doesn't necessarily always benefit, if not maybe specifically disadvantages our continent. So, who should lead the governance efforts of these complex and cross-sectoral technologies? That is the question that our esteemed panelists will be discussing. I'm not going to assume to know more than them. I'll let them answer that question. Um, and so our experts are well practiced in law, digital rights, and the regulation, and they're here to explore the emerging role of the African data protection authorities, as Adebora said, as the de facto AI regulators. And it's important to note here that these data protection authorities weren't originally designed for the role. I think Adebora said that top. But as AI is emerging as a huge risk in our sector, especially specifically to do with digital rights, we need these data protection authorities to look and develop guidance, assess risks, oversee algorithmic systems, because this affects millions of people. So in today's conversation, we'll examine how AI fits or stretches the existing data protection mandates, the sector-specific risks of DPAs, the data protection authorities, um, and the practical challenges of enforcement, technical capacity, and political independence. Um, so the conversation that I'm going to try and facilitate here is what African DPAs are currently doing on AI regulation, where the gaps lie, how sectoral reforms can shape regulatory authorities, whether AI-specific legislation is needed, and how to build institutional, technical, and cross-border capacity in the US government AI. Okay, so that's enough about me, enough from me. I'm going to now introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm going to introduce you briefly through your bio, and then I'd like you to just put your camera on and show your face for the rest of the session. So first and foremost, we have Amit Gadia, is a privacy lawyer from CIPP /E and AIGP, and a certified global privacy officer working in the UK and in Kenya. Amit is a leading data protection and privacy lawyer with over 27 years of legal experience. Amit has worked with major data protection projects for some of the largest organizations globally. Hello, Amit. Next, we have Anthony Sule. He's the Director of Security and Innovation at Resilience Technology and a builder of high-impact digital resilience solutions to protect organizations at the front line. He has done this for nearly a decade in 27 plus countries across Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. At Resilience Technology, he currently leads the development of scalable solutions that solve critical information security and threat concerns faced by communities at risk across Africa and the global south in general. He oversees the organization's flagship product, Zero Cloud, which automates threat prevention, detection, and response with intelligence reporting, outperforming traditional response methodologies by over 750%, Anthony.
750, yeah.
Wow, nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
And
you.
last but not least, we have Dr. Nelly Rotish. He's a research fellow at the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law, or CIPIT, at Strathmore University, where she plays a pivotal role in advancing research at the intersection of law, data governance, and artificial intelligence. Drawing on her extensive expertise, she explores the legal, ethical, and regulatory challenges posed by emerging technologies, contributing to the development of robust frameworks that balance innovation and data protection and accountability. At CIPIT, Nelly collaborates with a diverse array of academics, industry experts, and policymakers to craft solutions that ensure ethical AI implementation and responsible data management in an increasingly digital world. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Your CVs are much longer than mine. So happy to be joined by you today. So I kind of I think let's just jump straight into the conversation now. I think we've set the scene quite well. AI, as we understand it, is not a single technology. It's a suite of tools transforming everything from fintech, agriculture to healthcare and public services. So while AI promises immense benefits for Africa, its deployment, especially in the global south, raises critical questions about data privacy, bias, and accountability. So our discussion today will focus on the data protection authorities, which are established for data privacy. But with this emergence of AI being deployed and dumped into Africa effectively, they're at the forefront really of the conversation around regulation. So Dr. Nelly Rotish, I'm going to go to you first. Beyond the headlines of general AI strategy, are you aware of any instances on the continent where data protection principles have meaningfully shaped the design or deployment, of AI systems?
Thank you, Dan. Confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, a lot of that.
Awesome. It's a very interesting question, considering that most of the AI applications or tools within the African continent are still being developed. But it's also good because we get to evaluate whether or not what we have been doing in the years that we have had conversations about AI and subsequently seen, AI strategies being developed, and whether or not that has meaningfully impacted, I would say the entire life cycle of an AI tool, not necessarily just at the point of development, but just throughout the life cycle of the AI tool. Now, the question directed to me speaks to issues of, data protection principles and whether or not there has been translated into meaningful or, purposes, or has been used to just shape how the AI tools are being developed and also deployed. Now, for contextual purposes and for the benefit of the listener or our listeners, you need to just bear in mind that we have, data protection principles that are outlined in the existing about 40 data protection legislations within the African continent. And I believe this has been adapted from global legal instruments like the GDPR, which sets out, what should be considered when you are talking about data protection. Now, data protection principle speaks to how lawfulness of fairness and transparency of collection of data. It talks about issues of purpose limitation, in that you're supposed to collect data that is specific, explicit, and for a particular purpose. The principles also calls for data minimization. In this particular instance, you're supposed to minimize, the amount of data that you're going to collect. In addition, it's calling for data accuracy. It's an issue that is coming up in AI as well, where you need to have data that is accurate and up to date. It speaks to issues of storage limitations, where you're supposed to limit, how much and for how long you're going to collect or retain the data that you have already collected. It speaks to issues of integrity and confidentiality, which is very vital for AI. And lastly, it talks about accountability, where you're supposed to hold into account organizations that are in charge or owning AI systems. Now, whether or not these principles have been meaningfully applied, it's something that, we can have a debate about, but I have looked at this in two aspects. Number one is regulatory aspects related to it, and number two is use cases. Now, I'm talking about regulations because regulations have been very vital in how, or in shaping how AI strategies have been developed over time and subsequently impacted how, AI tools are being created. Regulations is important, specifically in aspects such as how it has impacted AI strategies. If you skim through various AI strategies and policies that we currently have with the continent, you could talk about the AU AI strategy. You'd see reference specifically to these particular principles, and there is a call for countries to incorporate that into their domestic legal frameworks, and also a call to, owners of AI tools to implement that. That in itself is a guiding framework for meaningful application of, these particular rules to the entire life cycle of an AI tool. The other key vital thing is, the call for privacy by design, which is something that over time, and you see new AI tools trying to incorporate this, where in building the tools themselves, they design AI in them so that at the design stage, you incorporate privacy. The converse of this is normally privacy by default, where you now see the continuous calls, right? We're calling on AI developers or even users of AI to comply with privacy, right? And that in itself is derived from regulation, which is quite vital when as we speak about, has it been meaningful in any way? And you'll see this coming up over and over again. The other key issue when you talk about regulation is, DPAs, the data protection impact assessments, and you would see this happening, and you would see data protection authorities, for example, declining to give approvals to, data owners from collecting data because they have not done data protection impact assessment, right? This is quite important because you would see the transition of it being incorporated, first of all, and how it has evolved to even call, and you would see, for instance, under the UNESCO recommendations on the ethics of AI, where, there's a call for ethical AI practices, specifically through ethical impact assessment, right? You could see this is transitioning from not just data protection impact assessment, but looking at the ethics as well. And this has been, through practice and how DPAs have been implemented in jurisdictions. I don't know to be biased, but for instance, in Kenya, I know the ODPC has been very keen on ensuring that there is compliance with these requirements for DPAs. Lastly, in terms of regulations, you're looking at just the overall compliance, where it's just a requirement. If you are dealing with personal data, you're supposed to comply, which is something impacting how AI tools are being managed and, collection and throughout the life cycle, I would say. For use cases, I came across three very notable cases, and I believe you have also interacted with this. The very first one, and something that is quite good for us in Kenya because it builds some jurisprudence, is the WorldCoin case in Kenya, if you do remember, which was collecting, the high-risk scams. And as a result of that, the ODPC as well as Parliament came together to give recommendations and also just recall for suspension of unlawful collection of the biometric data. That in itself is a result of the principles of data protection that was subsequently applied to an AI tool. That is number one in the case of Kenya. Way back in 2019, you also did see Morocco imposing a ban or a moratorium on the use of, facial recognition technology specifically just to ensure that, the AI space was regulated and to just allow for growth of the industry and subsequently regulation. Morocco currently has an AI strategy, and this is derived from that moratorium and a reflection of what is contained within the data protection legislation and specifically the principles that we are looking at. Lastly is Senegal as well, which rejected an application specifically by a company to use facial recognition to collect, data monitoring information for employees. So those are the few cases that I did come across. I know there are quite a number of them that do exist, but I believe those should give our listeners an idea of how we have been just not relying on data protection principles for data-related kind of technologies, but we're also transitioning them to AI. And I would say, yes, there have been meaningful application of this, and it's still growing though, and I think it's something that we should keep monitoring. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. So I think, with that, we've seen now in the examples that you've given, meaningful application of these data protection principles. And you mentioned, AI strategy coming out of Morocco. We've seen a similar thing here in South Africa with the sort of AI white paper, I think it was, that came out recently. But I think even in that case, it was published quite a long time ago. And so now we're asking the question, is it up to date with the way in which this technology is advancing? And so to go to you now, Amit, in terms of like meaningfully applying these data protection principles and going to what we were talking about today, are these data protection authorities well suited to lead or coordinate, regulation of AI? And are they suitably well studied or have the expertise to, place that foundation for regulation?
Thank you, Kemal. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me on this webinar. It's very timely, very informative. Thank you for this opportunity. Now, let's start. I mean, this question has a number of limbs. First of all, when we talk about regulations, are the data protection authorities, sufficiently empowered to regulate the AI systems which are being developed, AI models which are being developed in Africa? So first of all, when you talk about the AI, you're talking about the EU AI Act. So let's talk about that. Is the first and the first regulation in globally, and it's one of which sets one of the bar, a very high bar when it comes to regulating AI. So it divides risks. So it's a risk-based approach. So it's got prohibited risks, high risks, minimal risk, and limited risks. Without going too much into what each of these risks are. So first of all, the prohibited risks were banned. These are, for example, if you take emotion recognition or you take AI systems which actually recognize individuals in public spaces, and these are sensitive personal data, or workplace monitoring. A lot of these are prohibited, and they came into effect, the prohibition came into effect in August of this year. Most of the AI, the risks which are regulated are high-risk AI systems. So these are under the EU AI Act, and then you have the limited and the transparent risks as well. Importantly, the act is going to be phased out over the next few months, and you all already heard, if you follow AI news or AI regulation news like myself, the Swedish Prime Minister, he said that yesterday, I think even today, he said yesterday that they need to see if they can put brakes on some of these EU AI Acts provisions, and then if they can defer them to a later date, because it is first of all, they're getting US direct intervention from the US to stop the EU Act, or at least pause it for a while. I'll tell you why this is important for Africa. Now, Africa, out of the 55 African nations, 39 have a data protection law in place. And of those 39, I believe at least 34, if I get my numbers right, have a data protection authority in place. I have studied most of these African data protection laws, including the global data protection laws, because I'm a global privacy officer as well. It's not necessary for you to have a comprehensive AI regulator, because most of the data protection laws within Africa contain sufficient provisions within their own, the Data Protection Acts, to regulate AI without any form of regulation. And as the Swedish Prime Minister said yesterday, that if you regulate heavily, you are going to lose out on innovation. So it's really a balancing approach which you need to make. So first of all, from that angle, what are some of these provisions? So first of all, if you look at the recitals, a lot of these laws which are in place for the data protection authorities, many talk about that laws are applicable to automated and non-automated means. So automated, clearly that is without human intervention. It applies directly to AI systems and AI models. Secondly, my friend Nelly has already spoken about data minimization. Although the issue with data minimization, as you all know, artificial intelligence thrives on data. So you cannot really say we need to have data. We need to limit data, because then it will not serve your purpose. At the same time, there are schools of thought now that you can have synthetic data. For those of you who know what synthetic data is, it's basically data which mimics real life data, or privacy enhancing technologies, or you can have even privacy enhancing technologies similar to, say, federated learning, or similar areas where you can have only the central model which is being updated without, and so it's basically a preserving privacy. So there is and then the other important part is every data protection law in Africa, most of it, although at least the ones which I've read, contain a provision automated decision making. So automated decision making essentially is the decision which is made without human intervention. And there are certain exceptions to it. There are very narrow exceptions. So the automated decision directly applies to AI systems. So though there are not regulations in place, like the EU AI Act, which might which is at like the gold standard, or so-called the gold standard globally, there are provisions within the Data Protection Act, as well as some sectorial laws, where you can actually have regulate AI without having a formal regulation for AI itself. And obviously, the Data Protection Act is regulated, and compliance is overseen by data protection authorities and supervisory authorities. Now, even some of the countries where the data protection, the supervisory authorities do not have any form of AI regulations in place, a lot of these authorities are using the powers under the Data Protection Act so as to regulate some of these AI systems. So let me give you first example here. Where you talk about in spring of 2023, Garante is the Italian data protection authority. They actually issued an interim order against OpenAI. So we all know what OpenAI is. There's the people behind the ChatGPT to stop processing personal data of Italians and broadly Europeans. And then I believe there was a fine, which was in December 2024, where when the case finalized, the Italian Data Protection Authority fined 15 million euros to OpenAI. So this was the first example where the Data Protection Authority used its powers under the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe to actually fine an AI system, which was the ChatGPT, which was from OpenAI. After that, you've seen similar instances, for example, from the Brazilian Data Protection Authority, where they face similar issues with Meta. Then you saw similar issue in South Korea with the AI system, which where the South Korean Data Protection Authority used its powers under the Data Protection Act for similar reprimands on an organization called Alipay. So what is important is that the act itself, it can trigger the requirements and compliance with processing of personal data where processing of personal data is involved. More importantly, there's also the European Data Protection Board guideline where data protection is flexible, which protects the right of the individuals. So per se, you do not necessarily require comprehensive regulation, but now the issue arises is, would the data protection authorities have the capacity to handle some of these areas where AI systems are violating some of these laws under the Data Protection Act or the regulations. So the question arises, it all comes down to the awareness, training, capacity building, and more or less data protection and artificial intelligence would go hand in hand. However, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Hi. Sorry, was I muted all the time?
The funny is everyone still here? Can they hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
No. We heard you. We heard you.
Oh, okay, lovely. So I think I've said everything. All I was said in my last sentence or so is that, I mean, the data protection authorities will require, some form of capacity building, training, funding,
I think
to ensure that they are, they are well versed with some of these laws and regulations and the AI systems, which are moving very fast, so as to regulate them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. So Anthony, I'm going to come to you now because I think we've heard now in terms of how the data protection authorities are dealing with these, or how they could deal with these AI technologies. But I think what we need to now kind of understand is what systems are currently being deployed in the African context, and where do you see the biggest risks from these types of deployments coming from, in terms of harm or bias?
Right. Thank you so much, Kimal. Privileged to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Nelly and Ahmed. You've echoed quite a number of my thoughts on this topic. But to dive straight into it, I think I'd like to lay foundation very quickly, which I think is very obvious to everyone, but just in case some people are not aware. But I know AI has become very mainstream right now, but The truth is, I mean, with ChatGPT and the rest of these GPTs, you have AI being very mainstream at the moment, but we've been using AI for longer than before ChatGPT, and I think it's good for us to understand that, because it then gives us a broader perspective as to what. And I think Amit actually really gave a very good definition of what AIs are, which is pretty much machines using data to make a decision. It's as simple as that. We can build on top of it. We can continue to iterate on top of that definition, and that gives us different AI systems. But at a very foundational level, AI is pretty much machines making decisions when you supply it with different data. And we've been doing that for a long time. Think about Facebook days. I don't know if many people use Facebook again, but earlier, 2013, 2010, thereabout, Facebook would suggest to you that, oh, there's somebody in your locality, or maybe just because you are friends with somebody, Facebook would suggest to you that you might actually know this person because you're friends with 2 or 3 other people, and in the accuracy of that just starts to grow, and that's really AI in a nutshell, right? Because it's using data to really make decision and provide you with suggestions. So speaking about that, we've actually had a lot of AI systems even before ChatGPT within the African system, within the African ecosystem. So in our policing, we've seen some of that, right, with facial recognition, in our elections as well. In healthcare as well, we've seen a lot of AI use through the years. But when we talk about harm, and I think I'm more a technical person, and so you probably want to speak from a technical social entrepreneurship point of view. But when we talk about the harm, let me be sure that I'm not just speaking to myself. You can hear me, right? Okay, great. When we talk about the harm of AI systems, I think it's more about the abuse and the misuse of it. And I think that the AI systems that would be the most exploited in terms of bias, in terms of harm and abuse, are systems that state or non-state actors can actually leverage or take advantage of to cause widespread harm. And I think for me, the most notable example would be AI systems that we deploy around elections. And the reason I say that is because you have systems that are deployed which, quote unquote, sort of like disenfranchises people from making decisions that affect their lives for a long time. And so you have systems in place where the way you use it and the way you leverage the output from that machine, from those systems, the lives of people can actually be put in jeopardy. And this is not just like a small number of people. We're talking about nations, right, and entire regions. And I'll give an example of the Nigerian elections, the last Nigerian elections in 2023. There's a very popular example of a very popular video rather of a thug that went to this part of Lagos where you mostly have opposition people living in, and they really just came with full force and threatened people to go back home, that they wouldn't vote in these elections, right? And there's such a AI example within that physical example I just gave, because now this is human brute force in place. However, you can actually use AI systems to disenfranchise people in that way. And I'll give another example. Because in such a system, right, in subsequent elections, and I think we've seen this across the continent actually, you can actually let people, in that scenario, in this case, people weren't allowed to come to vote, right? They were using brute force because they've located hotspots where oppositions were coming to vote and saying, you know what, you can't vote, you have to go back home. And by doing so, disenfranchising a lot of people. You can actually use machines to do that. You can use AI to do that. So imagine a situation where they no longer use brute force, but they can actually allow you to vote. And just because they know those hotspots as well, and then machines can actually help you identify places. I mean, you can actually do scraping of social media data and the rest of it, and use it. You can feed all of that into a system, and just based on the inferences from that, you can actually tell locations where you should be very wary of the outcomes from those places, because that's where your positions are and they are very unlikely to vote for you. And so the kind of thing, we've mostly seen a lot of brute force in terms of how authoritarian governments on the continent either silent dissidents or or clamp down on free speech and the rest of it. But we're now entering a sweet spot, permit me to use that, in our globalization and in our advancement as a society, where you actually don't need to put boots on the ground anymore to achieve that. You can actually use AI systems. And for me, that is the most worrying misuse or abuse of AI that I can actually see from the African context right now, because some of the things that we as a society, we did, I mean, this is a civil society conversation, some of the things that we actually clamor for and kind of governance and ethics. Okay, I was going to take that as my cue to wrap up, so I will just wrap up. Okay, so to just summarize that, what I mean is, I think for me, the biggest concerns, and there are several examples of this, in our immigration, in our policing, but especially in our electioneering process, the biggest areas, or the riskiest areas where there's likely to be harm and abuse of AI systems, are the areas where state actors, as I mentioned, or non-state actors can actually take advantage of systems that affect us as a collective. And for me, the election system that's currently in place in Africa is probably the most critical and the most vital. So I would put that as top of the pyramid for me. And then there are others that come in place as well, like with the policing system, with our immigration system as well. Those come right on that. But our elections are very critical because it gives us a voice to make a decision as to who governs us and how we want to grow as a society. And AI actually now has a very critical role to play in that, because it can actually stop us from making that decision, and it's very, very scary.
Thanks, Anthony. I think you touched on something really important there. Is it's not the AI system in of itself that is creating the harm and the bias, but it's existing power structures and power imbalances already present within society, specifically in Africa, in terms of this conversation. And then the use of that AI to uphold those power structures. And so I think, the elections is the first thing that everyone's mind, I think, goes to immediately. We're talking about political micro-targeting when it comes to election campaigning, and how that the system of campaigning is now using the data that AI has very, innocently collected to target market us in terms of campaign policies, but also, clamping down on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But you did mention also, the other two in terms of security risks that are present. And the other one that I want to mention maybe is also, the financial sector. So Doctor, I'm going to come to you now and maybe ask you, when AI is used in these very sort of sensitive sectors like security and finance, what kind of specific measures can we see from the DPAs, or what they should consider in order to ensure safety, and responsible use and ethical use, specifically within the security and the finance sector? Because I think Anthony's covered us on the election part.
Yeah, yes, Daniel. I just want to build on what Anthony was talking about, just picking up from the harms that, we see in the use of the AI tools. Now, in this particular instance, we want to see how that impacts, the sensitive sectors like security and finance, and how does, data protection authorities come in to just ensure that there is some safety, some responsibility, and that data is being used in an ethical manner. Now, I just want the listeners to bear in mind the harms, and I want to build on it that were highlighted by Anthony. Just moving away from just election periods, you want to see insecurity. Talk of surveillance, for example. If facial recognition is used for surveillance, it's an harmful thing. In finance, you want to imagine how your transactional patterns are being monitored in a way that then gives some form of prediction of how you transact, and that can be used against you, for example, for to commit a fraud, or you don't want to look at it in terms of just the positive aspects that are brought about by using AI in these key sectors, but you want to bear in mind the consequences or the harms that do result from employing AI in these particular sectors. Now, what can DPAs or data protection authorities do to ensure that there is some form of safety or responsibility in the overall use of the data, and generally just ethical compliance in the collection of data throughout the life cycle of whatever tools that is being used by these players within these sectors that we consider to be a bit sensitive. Now, the first thing that I would want to see DPAs do is just make data protection impact assessments quite mandatory. And I want to extend the conversation to ethical impact assessments, because we're also looking at how is the data being collected? Is it being collected in an ethical manner? How is it being used, subsequently once the AI tool has been, developed, right? So you want to make DPI as mandatory to just understand the risk before you even go ahead to just continue developing or building the tool. So that is the first thing I would want to see. Number two is I would want DPAs to specifically call for transparency and accountability throughout the cycles of these AI systems. Specifically, you want to understand how the data is being collected and how it's being used. Transparency is very important in this particular instance if you want to minimize, for example, bias and discrimination, because you need to understand, right, how this, data was being collected and how it has been used. You don't want to just see the end result. You want to understand the data collection processes, and this can only be realized through transparency and, accountability by the owners of the AI tools that are being used. So I'd want to push for that. Number three, I want to see, continuous, supervision to see that there is compliance with data protection legislations throughout, right? I'm emphasizing continuous because you don't want to see it at inception, but you want to see, the owners of the AI systems continuously complying with data protection legislations. What DPS can equally do is mandate regular audits to just detect bias and discrimination, right? Because then at times, it may not be detected, for instance, at inception, but over time that can be detected. So if it's something that is continuous or, a frequent regular auditing of the AI systems in itself can help mitigate some of these challenges that are being brought about by the AI tools in these sensitive sectors. In addition to that, you want to see DPAs engaging with stakeholders, because it takes a multi-stakeholder approach to just ensure that we are fully compliant and that we are shaping, AI regulations in the manner that we deem fit, depending on how the system or the AI space is evolving. So engagement with stakeholders is something that DPA should consider. Besides that, you want to see, DPAs recommending, these institutions specifically to train their employees, because it takes, not only the owners, but several other people within the, sectors themselves to just manage and ensure that there's continuous safety, there's continuous responsibility, continuous ethical compliance. So if you're going to train your employees, you're helping in ensuring that, there's continuous compliance, and this will ease the work of the DPA. So make that mandatory somehow, so that, we have a chain of people ensuring that there's compliance. In addition to that, you want to consider how you take feedback, right? It takes feedback from the public, it takes feedback from stakeholders. You want to see how, CSOs, for example, are interacting with these tools or how they have been impacted in some way. So DPA should take feedback, right, from the public so that they can, develop, some actions or take actions or as the oversight authority. You also want to see them updating laws regularly. We have been talking about how the AI is growing, it's evolving. So an update of the laws is something that DPAs could prompt or help, see to it that it is realized. Lastly, and this is something that I have seen in Kenya, is how DPAs, for example, develop guidelines specifically for particular sectors. And in these very sensitive sectors, you'd want to see how, guidelines are being developed to just guide how the data is being utilized in these particular sectors. So you see in Kenya, for example, you'll find the ODPC guidelines for processing of biometric data, which I think is very vital in this particular instance, and very useful for such sectors that would often tend to use biometric data. So all those key issues is something that I would want to see, or I would urge, the data protection authorities within the continent to consider, to just ensure that there is safety of, and just responsibility in the collection of the data. Thank you, Daniel. Over to you.
Thank you, Doctor. So I think, you know, what Dr. Otis has covered now is actually a very comprehensive list of like what the data protection authorities need to consider when, it's regulating from a safety, responsibility, and ethical point of view. And I think it segues nicely into the question I want to ask Amit now about, so when we look at AI, it's not a one size fits all kind of um, system. It's very adaptive in nature. It's machine learning, as Anthony had spoken to us about earlier. And so I think what kind of regulatory model should we be asking the DPAs to um, champion? I mean, the prompt here is, should it be as adaptive and, risk based as the technology itself? Because we'll see it ever evolving. Um, and we need a regulatory framework that we can't just constantly update and amend our regulations as technology advances past what we've already done. And so we need a model that effectively adapts to the system. So yeah, Amit, how do we do that, and how do we ask the DPAs to champion the system? Because
Good question, and I think that's $1 million question which everybody is asking at the moment. I mean, it's probably a question which is never going to be answered because you cannot have one model. It's as simple as that. Having said that, there are fragmented models around the globe at the moment. Like, for example, if you you say the risk-based approach. Yes, of course, it has to be a risk-based approach. So let's take, for example, again, I go back to the EU AI Act, where they've got risk-based on prohibited AI systems. You've got the high-risk AI systems, limited and minimal AI risk systems. So, for example, if you have a chatbot, right, that falls under a limited AI risk, and then so it's relatively low. But most importantly, all of them will require transparency. However, the bottom line, even before looking at the specific model and models which might be fitting one size fits all, let's try and have some baseline as to what is required for every AI system to be compliant. So the bottom line is transparency and accountability. That's the bottom line. That's the starting point, right? So once you start with that, a model which has that, then of course, then you'll be able to build from there. At the same time, data protection authorities should then guide. Even if you have any form of regulation, they should have some form of sectorial specific guidelines. So, for example, if you're in the health sector, which is high risk, then at least the data protection authorities should inform that, look, these are high risk, these sensitive data. You are now required to conduct a data protection impact assessment, as Nelly said. You're meant to, if you are transferring data outside of, say, an African jurisdiction, you need to have proper transfer impact assessments done. You need to make sure you are sending data to a country where there is commensurate data protection laws. And the other important part, as Anthony mentioned earlier, and I believe you also mentioned, is the question of bias. Under the EU AI Act, there is the question that the high-risk AI systems are supposed to have human oversight, right? But my question remains: is like, if you are going to bias, humans are inherently biased. So who is going to oversee the humans, right? So long as you have humans overseeing AI systems, right, you are going to have bias, right? It's like trying to say, okay, I mean, it's just not possible. So I think we need to have a common sense approach as to, if you do need to have a model, which sort of model do you need to have? More importantly, you will find that a lot of the organizations, whatever their size, they are now pushing their way into AI systems, developing AI systems. You see mind-boggling figures. Some of them are even small businesses who cannot afford this, the resources required to have these models in place, because it requires resources in terms of, for example, data centers, expertise, financial resources. where are they meant to get this from? And then more importantly, as we all know, that AI systems evolve, and then if you are going to have, they start with say minimum an AI risk, and then it keeps on evolving by the very nature of the AI system that due to the patterns, then it evolves into a high risk prohibited AI risk system, then you have another problem. So I think at the moment, I wish I had a magic wand, which I don't. But I mean, I think as a broad view, we need to have some form of some baseline where to start with. Have assistance for small players in the market, not only the big techs. And then, of course, equip the data protection authorities with the relevant resources. Yeah.
Thank you, Amit. And so you mentioned the $1 million question. Anthony, I'm going to ask you now the $1 billion question. Um, where, where does the private sector fit into this whole conversation around, strengthening the DPAs? This is the sector that's developing the technology in which we're talking about regulating. They're the ones that's got the expertise. They're the ones that are developing this technology, and they're the ones that are, profiting off, maybe profiting off, allegedly, the lack of regulation around this field. So what role can they play in strengthening the DPAs, but rather maybe differently, what role can the DPAs and maybe the regional frameworks of Africa play in making sure that they do play a role in strengthening regulatory protections in Africa? And you have 4 minutes to answer that question because you're short on time.
Sure, I will just be very quick with this. So I think that there's really no incentives for any incentive at all for private sector to actually try to strengthen DPA at the moment. And the reason I say that is because we're using AI for different things. In this meeting, I can count like very many AI systems at play, whether within your Zoom and the way your camera moves along with you and everything. Despite how interesting and how advanced things like AI currently is, we're still playing in like the 5% capabilities within the realm of AI. Right now, despite all we have, we're still playing within the artificial narrow intelligence sphere. And progressively, we can get to the artificial general intelligence and then artificial super intelligence. Now, for private sector, which of course is driven by profits, there is still a lot to cover. There's still a lot of innovation to build. There's still a lot of things to research on, improve systems, train more transformers, and the rest of that, collect a lot more data. Because for each of this geometric progression we're going to see with AI, the key determinant is really how much data we can have access to. And that's what private sectors can actually use to build the systems. Now, that said, there's really no incentive, therefore, for them to want to strengthen the regulators. And I think I very much like the example Amit gave at the start when he talked about like the Swedish government trying to, we need to take a step back. I don't know whether that was influenced by the US or not, but it actually makes for very good reading. The fact that only Europe currently has very strong legislation around AI governance and AI privacy and ethics. America doesn't have any federal legislation or governance ethics around AI.
In fact, Anthony, if I may interrupt, the US and the president of US, they is now attempting to propose a ban for 10 years on AI regulations.
And that's
right? So you can imagine.
That is very, for me, it spells something. I mean, is a
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, absolutely. I love that. It's a capitalist country and they want to make profits. They want their businesses and their the OpenAI and Oracle and the rest of them to make profits, because otherwise they have competing nations like China who would take the lead on AI development. And it's almost like having nuclear energy, right? It's almost like state warfare. Whoever gets there first has the advantage. And so there's no incentive for private sector who are racing, and whether it's in Africa or outside of Africa, I don't see why as a business, while I'm racing to get to these new technologies and become globally competitive and relevant, why I should want to strengthen the DPAs who would in turn come to regulate me. But that said, I think also that, and I think Amit has also spoken to this, the fact that the way if we look at the EU board, like the EU AI board, and we look at the GDPR board, we see that the composition is very different, right? Because the way they have to approach regulation has to be different. While one strictly deals with data protection, with the way we're going to approach data use within the AI system, within the AI sphere, it's going to be it's going to be somewhat different in a way that it requires us to revisit how we approach regulation in general. So what I mean in essence is, and I think Amit mentioned this. So we're looking at risk-based when we're talking about AI governance. Oh my God, I know I'm out of time. Let me just wrap this up quickly. Point I'm trying to make here is, in the short to medium term, and I'm saying 1 year to 5 years, there's really no incentive for private sector to really support DPAs. DPAs have to actually do this work themselves, in the sense that their makeup has to slightly shift, has to slightly change, in the sense that we can't just, the way we approach ethics governance shouldn't be about stifling innovation. And right now it is, because most of the data protection regulation on the continent is really just copying the GDPR and then replicating it here. And that stifles innovation, right? That has to change, right? If we know that you can't stop AI, how do we really change our approach in a way that we can still protect people, but we don't stifle innovation? It's only when DPAs are built to that point that I think conversations with private sectors can be more productive, because they know we're not being regulated to make us stop. We're being supported to make sure we're doing our work in the best way, such that across regions and across ecosystems, we're still relevant. Because if you build a solution in Africa, for instance, and want to export to, say, the Europe, it makes a lot of sense that you've done a lot of regulations and a lot of compliance with local standards, which are also exportable for you to be relevant in that sphere. So DPAs need to move from being regulating to stifle innovation to supporting innovation. And I think in that sense, and this cannot happen in 5 years. This has to change progressively over time. And I think it's only when we get there that the collaboration and synergy between DPAs and private sectors can work.
Thank you, Anthony. I had a last question that I was supposed to ask, but I think I'm just gonna, because it's now time for everyone else's chance to ask questions. So before I go on to that last question, I want to give people the chance to put their hands up and let me know if you want to ask our three wonderful panelists a question. Just put your hand up and then I'll just acknowledge it, and then you can go ahead. I have many other things I want to talk to them about, so if you don't, I will. So the next question I had was about capacity, and how do we talk about civil society and experts such as yourselves who are coming into this sector and pushing for these DPAs to be empowered. But I wanted to ask a follow-up question to what you were talking about, Anthony, about getting the DPAs to do the work for the private sector itself. And I'm thinking about the EU model now a little bit, and about what the opportunity now that's coming out of the African Commission for People and Human Rights, with the resolutions on data integrity, data protection, and basically the call for the special rapporteur to go around the continent and to actually collect consultation stories about how do we make a contextual set of guidelines around this sector and around AI and data collection and that kind of stuff. So, and this isn't a question specifically for you, Anthony, this is for anyone to jump in, but is that an opportunity maybe where we can empower these DPAs, maybe not just at the state level, but also at the regional level?
I have my thoughts are very technocratic, which might not be very, which I think might conflict the essence and the ethos of this meeting. So I think I'm going to defer first to Amit and see if I have thoughts afterwards. But yeah, I'm just going to come afterwards if I have to.
Thank you. So I think, Kemal, as you said, this is a very, very good opportunity for Africa, where majority of the population are young people. And as you know, there is an abundance of opportunity to collect diverse data, collect data which can then be unbiased data, and then feed it into AI systems. However, if you are going to have regulations and then the DPAs are going to be strict about what you can and what you cannot do, similar to the EU AI Act, I think we'll miss the boat. So my suggestion would be, go for like a pro-innovation approach. So what the United Kingdom is doing at the moment, right? So for example, you have the pro-innovation, like, sectorial guidelines. As for example, if you are in the health sector, you are in the financial sector, or you are into a low risk sector, for example, like, developing chatbots, have sectorial guidelines, test them out, then have emphasis on, ethical, human-centric approach to artificial intelligence, right? And that is, and then at the same time also make sure you have codes of conduct and, like what you call soft law instruments. So what will happen is that then once most of, if you African jurisdictions, then they agree, they get together and agree, okay, let's not have per se have a regulation, but let's have this soft law approach. In that way, we will attract some of the world's best talent, some of the world's best companies to come and invest in Africa, right? And then overall, if you really see the need, then have regulations in place. But in the first place, as you can see, I mean, even EU is now thinking twice about the EU AI Act. So we really don't want to go in the hard approach. Let's go for the soft law to start with.
Anthony?
Amit's just said everything in my mind, so there's no point saying anything else. Yeah, but that's really my stand as well. I think pro-innovation, let's get competing, let's be involved in the race to some of these technologies. And the reason also is because I'll just give a very quick example. When we think about the I think the Huduma number, so the Kenyan integrated immigration number system, something like that. One of the reasons why there was a lot of pushback to that is because the Kenyan government really outsourced the development of that project to a European company, right? And so imagine leaving all of your data to a European company to build something. And so it raised a lot of privacy concerns and people push back against it. Now, if we have local companies competing in the AI race and building solutions that eliminate some of these biases we're seeing with global systems and that work for our context, it helps us to actually be more safer on the long term, rather than just importing some of these technologies and making them work for us. So I would say pro-innovation first, and then we can regulate much later.
I just want to, we have a couple minutes before I need to ask my panelists to conclude. So are there any questions at all from the crowd? I'm sure you guys have all been listening very intently. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to ask each of you to conclude some last thoughts that you guys might have about the conversation that we've had. And in it, I want to maybe ask my last question about capacitating advocates in civil society. So while you're, making concluding points, maybe just some brief suggestions about what you think civil society should do in this space to advocate for the support of DPAs, or if you think that that's something that they should be focusing on. Obviously, you guys must say what you want to say. But I just wanted to say, thank you so much for answering the questions. It was a really fruitful conversation, I think. And I certainly enjoyed it. So I'm going to go in the order that I was asking you questions. Nelly, on to you first.
Thank you, Dan. And I'm just coming in after, Anthony has expressed his views about regulation. And for me, I think I'll be on this other side of the divide where I'll be calling for regulation. I'm working in the private sector, and we work closely with the Office of the ODPC, and, our call is compliance all through. Not really just speaking to the laws being in existence, but we want to see to it that there are systems or tools that are being built on the basis of trust, because the key issue is, do we trust the AI tools that we see today? So regulation for us is an avenue to just create tools that are compliant with data protection related requirements, and also just ethical collection and use of the data. So for me, I think I'll have contrary views on just, not really discouraging innovation, but rather just ensuring that as we innovate, why don't we also just ensure that we are complying with existing policies on data collection and use? That way we build systems that are compliant long term. For instance, when you talk about privacy by design, why don't you build systems that by design comply with privacy, for instance, and then just go ahead to just continue just being continuously compliant, or just being, taking into consideration ethical requirements throughout the cycle of the AI tools. So that way the tools will be compliant throughout. Anthony, you may want to counter that when you make your closing remarks. But in terms of just having advocates and CSOs help the DPAs, I think this is some of the things that we do. And such a forum, for example, is for civic education, for instance, I would say. So one way is just enlightening the people on how, on the AI tools themselves and what they need to look out for example, on privacy requirements they need to be aware of. It comes from the point of understanding before you can then challenge or be informed about what kinds of data, how you should see your data being used. So that kind of awareness is something that CSOs can do. The other thing that maybe CSOs can do is help with the research work, right? You can just conduct research, primary data collection from the very people that are being impacted by AI tools. You see conversations about just how we are living out indigenous communities within the African continent. CSOs can just get to the grassroots, engage the very people that are using or if affected by these AI tools to just understand their perspectives and also just help collect the data that is very particular to these people within these communities. The other key thing is collaboration, as we spoke about this earlier. DPA works on or builds its work on collaboration, and this is where CSOs do come in, as well as just advocates. In terms of just, aiding in policies, you want to see them coming up with toolkits, for example, on how, the AI tools should be dealing with the data and just ensuring that, we are on the right track and just building AI tools that are trustworthy. I'll let Amit and Anthony just add on to what I have left out. But thank you, Daniel, and your team for inviting us for this very important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kemal. On my part, basically, I think Nelly's covered quite a number of things which I wanted to state. But then let's remember that we are living in most of the country, all countries in Africa, we are developing countries, right? And one of the biggest issues here is lack of awareness, but that lack of awareness requires funding and resources. So unless you have support from the central body, unless the government provides funding, everything else then remains a theory. So that's just what I wanted to add on top of what Nelly said. Secondly, Nelly has touched on this. So for example, whether you talk about Lagos or Joburg, or you talk about Nairobi, data protection awareness is more or less centered around the center. Right, you ask anybody in the rural areas or some of the cities even outside of Nairobi, majority are not aware of what data protection is. And this, I'm not talking about individuals, right? That is a bit far-fetched. We are talking about businesses, right? So it's very important for that awareness to be spread, that AI systems and data protection go hand in hand. So and I know for a fact that the Office of Data Protection Commissioner, they've been doing a fantastic job of spreading the awareness. But again, there's just a limitation to how much they can do. It is a very new space. Data protection, generally speaking, in Africa has not been in place for almost just over 6 years now. Because first, the very first data protection laws were incorporated in 2020, around 2017, 2018, I believe. Cote d'Ivoire was one of the first ones, and then Ghana. And most data protection authorities have that. So I think where credit is due, it needs to be given. They've done a fantastic job, but again, there are limitations.
Anthony?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kemal. Thank you, Dr. Nelly, Amit, and Dr. Nelly, absolutely not. That's it. That's a brilliant counter. I think the reason why we need both sides of this conversation is because they are actually very important. We need people who push for Africa to build things, and we need people who make sure that Africa is built in the right way. So I think those, both sides of the conversations are very important. I think if I'm going to say one thing, and it's going to be consistent with what I've been saying so far, to civil society, it would be that we need to embrace a lot more innovation. And I don't want to sound like a broken record. And the reason I say we need to embrace more innovation, civil societies, because they're, whether we like it or not, AI is changing the nature of the work that we do and changing how we do that work, how quickly we do that work. And I'm going to give one very simple example. I think almost every year we have elections in Africa. And I think 2 weeks ago, I saw some, and we may have seen this on social media. I saw some very hyper-realistic videos made of like Black American people in different settings. And it took me a second to actually realize they were AI-generated videos. And I'm very familiar with these things, but it took me a hot second to actually figure that out. And I can just imagine progressively what that would look like in shaping and interfering with elections and the rest of it in Africa. And I want to see, personally, I would like to see, and this is just one example out of many, I would like to see a situation where civil society themselves are embracing technology a lot more, embracing the use of AI a lot more to be able to counter. And I think in previous years, we've had fact-checking systems like Dubawa and the rest of it. Now we need to do something that tops that. We need to do something that's able to fact-check the kind of content and the kind of images and videos we're seeing coming from AI systems, because those will be very critical in our electioneering process. Somebody can get arrested for something they didn't do. I need civil society organizations to start looking in that direction. Beyond just saying we need to regulate, how do we embrace the technology and the innovation to make sure that the changing landscape around civil freedom and civil society, we are also prepared for that? Because like it or not, nation states are going to take advantage of this. What are civil society organizations doing on the other hand to make sure that we can counter with the right tools, with the right technology, saying, you know what, this video is AI generated? Because in a few years from now, it will be very difficult. Imagine if you and I, educated people living and traveling a lot, can scarcely distinguish at this time what is AI generated and what is not. What would people living in remote regions that don't have access to this technology and exposure? You show them a video and they can pick up machetes and go fight each other and kill people because of something that's AI generated. So civil society needs to move from, we need to regulate to how do we embrace this to make sure that the changing landscape around civil society and press freedom, we will be ready for that, because whether we like it or not, nation states are going to take advantage of that in the future. So that will be my final thoughts.
Thank you so much, Nelly, Amit, and Anthony. I think this was a very fruitful conversation. I think what we can take out of it is that, civil society needs to be as immersed amongst the technology in which it's asking to be regulated. But I think, obviously, as Dr. Nelly has said, regulation is still quite important. I think with that, we're not quite out of time, but I don't see any burning questions from the crowd. Just some clapping from Yvonne. Thank you, Yvonne. And I clap too. Thank you guys so much. So with that, I just want to say thank you everyone for attending. Please remember to follow AIRA on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, or you can visit their website, which is AIRA.Africa. Have a good day, and you three, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.